All right, I think those logging in have started to slow down, so we will go ahead and start our evening. Starting us off this evening is Executive Director of the Adirondack Land Trust, Mike Carr. He will introduce each of the panelists for us this evening.
Thanks, Kimberly. It's really a pleasure to see so many people join. We had 131 people register. I think we're at about 74 now online. It's a beautiful night here in Keene. And we're excited about the program. We're really honored too that the founding director of the Adirondack Land Trust, George Davis, has joined us from Portland, Oregon. George, thanks so much for making time. He and his wife, Anita, live out west now. Well, I've always considered myself a career tree hugger, frankly, but I was in the woodshed the other day and I realized I actually own 5 chainsaws, and I think that might disqualify me from that title. I'll have to check with McKaylee and Heidi and Charlie and see how they feel about that. I just sort of collect them. One of them actually belonged to Clarence Petty. It was a gift from his son, Ed, but it has absolutely no safety gear on it. So it's really a museum piece. It runs beautifully, but I don't know a plastic surgeon, so I think I'm going to leave it on the shelf. Well, before we introduce our panelists, I'd like to briefly introduce the Adirondack Land Trust and explain why we're interested in hearing what these scientists have to say about Adirondack forests. George Davis founded the Adirondack Land Trust in 1984 to meet a need for a private organization to focus on the protection of the forests, the farms, the scenic vistas and wild shorelines that are critical to the character and the vitality of the Adirondack Park. Over the past 36 years, we've helped to protect 26,632 acres. That's more than 2 acres a day, 7 days a week for 36 years. That includes 6,301 acres of private working forest, which are actively managed to generate revenue from timber and other forest products. And another 4,300 acres of forever wild forest reserve where logging is not allowed. In addition, we own and manage 600 acres of our own land. Since our founding in 1984, our focus has evolved, but some things have not changed. One of the priorities of our current strategic plan is to keep the Adirondack forest intact and healthy at park-wide scale. Part of that work is to sustain lands that enhance our region's rural landscape and economy, viable livelihoods, and the aesthetics of the Adirondack Park. So this evening, like most of you, I'm here to listen in hopes of better understanding our remarkable Adirondack landscape and better understand what role Land Trust can play. One of the things I really like most about this work is the people that it attracts, and I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. First is Dr. Charlie Canham. He's a forest ecologist with Carey Institute and author of a fascinating book published this year by Yale University Press, Forests Adrift: Currents Shaping the Future of Northeastern Trees. Charlie studies the dynamics of forest ecosystems and how they respond to a wide range of human impacts. Using field research, novel statistical method, and computer models, he predicts forest response to factors including climate change, introduced pests and pathogens, logging, and air pollution. Charlie serves on the board of the Adirondack Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy's Adirondack chapter, and the Adirondack Council. His next book will focus on advancing the ecological foundation of a new forestry approach for the northeastern United States. Next is Dr. McKaylee Glennon. She's an ecologist and science director for the Adirondack Watershed Institute at Paul Smith College. She was previously director of science for the Adirondack program of the Wildlife Conservation Society. McKaylee is interested in the effects of land use management on wildlife populations in the Adirondacks and is engaged in research ranging from issues of residential development to recreation ecology to aquatic invasive species and climate change. She and Dr. Heidi Kretzer developed a research program examining impacts of low-density residential developments on birds and other animals. Michele also leads a long-term project focused on low-elevation Adirondack boreal birds in a warming climate. She serves as adjunct faculty for the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. She obtained her MS and PhD in environmental and forest biology from SUNY ESF. She grew up in Lake Placid and lives in Raybrook with her husband, Scott, and their 2 children. Next is Dr. Heidi Kretzer. Moderating this conversation, she's our newest board member. Heidi left her family on a perfectly good campsite on Lower Saranac tonight to lead this conversation. As a conservation social scientist with the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Heidi improves the conservation of wildlife and wildlands by incorporating tools and perspectives from the social scientists into conservation practice. She is widely published, and her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and on national public radio. Heidi serves as an adjunct associate professor at Cornell University's Department of Natural Resources and is affiliated with the Cornell Center for Conservation Social Sciences. She completed her PhD in Natural Resource Policy and Management at Cornell University and has a Master's of Environmental Studies from the Yale School of Forestry. Heidi grew up in Vermontville and lives at Saranac Lake with her husband, Andy Keel, and their 2 fifth-generation Adirondack children. With that, Dr. Heidi Kretzer.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Mike, for that nice introduction. Thank you all for logging in from wherever you may be on this beautiful evening. Thank you to Mary, Phil, and Kimberly, and others behind the scenes who are making it possible for us to engage in and enjoy this conversation tonight between 2 of my favorite scientists about my favorite place, the Adirondacks. To start, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional homelands of the Haudenosaunee people, a term that refers to the 6 nations or the Iroquois Confederacy. We will place a link in the chat box if you are interested in learning more about the land we are on. 20 years ago, while working with the Wildlife Conservation Society, I helped support the creation and production of the Adirondack Atlas. I'd like to revisit that 2004 book by Jerry Jenkins with Andy Keel. In the chapter on animals and plants, Jenkins writes about 4 central themes affecting the biological geography of the park. These themes include northernness, decline and recovery, the overlap of people and animals, and change over time. I'd like to use these themes to frame the discussions this evening, leaving time at the end for ample questions from the audience, which I invite you to post in the Q&A box at any time during the session, or you can hold them until the end. So jumping right into theme 1, the topic of northernness, Jenkins writes, the Adirondacks, which in many ways are like a detached piece of the Canadian Shield, contain more boreal evergreen forests than any of the mountains around them. But the evergreen forests of the Adirondacks, unlike the solid conifer forests of the Canadian Shield, are surrounded by and interspersed with deciduous ones. The Adirondacks are really a temperate boreal mosaic, equally different from the Catskills and from Canada, with features all their own. So to Charlie, I'd like to have you start this off.
And
please enlighten us about some of the features of forests in the Adirondacks that make this place so unique.
First, I have to tell Mike that I think I qualify as a professional tree hugger, and I have 4 chainsaws, Mike. That might be the limit. You might have to give that one of Clarence's to the museum. So think about that. And I also want to point out that Ed McNeil created the Northern Forest Atlas project many years ago to make sure that Jerry could continue his work on the biology and natural history and ecology of northern forests. And so if you haven't seen Jerry's amazing field guides and digital products, or Ed's remarkable videos on Adirondack forests and lakes and rivers, you should check out northernforestatlas.org. Yeah, you know, actually, Jerry and I debate this question quite a bit, and we actually come at it in different ways. I come from an academic background in philosophy that forests don't neatly assemble themselves into nice, discrete, identifiable types. Basically, forests consist of, like all plant communities, of species whose distributions overlap. They have similar environmental tolerances. They respond to the underlying environment and they interact with each other, but there's no natural division. You can't walk into the forest and say, I'm in this type of forest. You're going to find an almost infinite variety. So what matters is the overlap of species that you find. And, you know, when we think of northern forests more broadly, you know, we do think of them as this broad, very broad transition between the true boreal forests of Canada, far northern Canada. And yes, they are conifer dominated, but there are a bunch of deciduous species there, birches and aspens and so forth. And the very diverse temperate forests to the south that extend all the way down to the Gulf Coast. And so in many ways, what makes the Adirondacks, and in fact the northern forest region, distinctive is this overlap. But it's certainly true that for most people, it's the abundance of these northern conifers that are at their southern range limit. Things like balsam fir, red spruce, white spruce, even black spruce in our bogs, that really give us that northern feel. But we can't forget that the other half of this Adirondack mosaic are the southern species. And you know, beech is a really good example of this. Beech grows all the way to the south to the mountains of Mexico. It extends north into the Maritimes and up well into Quebec. But it is the iconic Adirondack species. In that vast range, there's nowhere that it is more abundant now or for the last 5,000 or 6,000 years than in the Adirondacks. And so, you know, within the northern forest region, the Adirondacks is the place that has the greatest number of species overlapping, and therefore we have the most diverse of the northern forests here in the Adirondacks.
Thanks, Charlie. And to Michele, tell us about how these unique forest and habitat features translate into the world of wildlife.
Well, I would agree with what Charlie said about the overlap of species, and that extends right into wildlife as well, because we are located on the sort of transition between these two biomes. We have the advantage of having some northern, you know, Canadian friends who are a part of our faunal community, but very much mixed within the sort of more familiar temperate species whose ranges go quite far to the south of us. So if you think about something like the moose, and if you looked at its distribution within North America, it would kind of be all across that boreal zone, sort of the true boreal, and then the southern range extent of it is right about where we are here in the park. And the components of the wildlife and the northernness of the park that I know best are actually the birds, whose distribution looks exactly like the moose. So these are things like gray jay and rusty blackbird and the iconic spruce grouse and Lincoln sparrow, and lots of birds that we find in, for me in particular, some peatlands. And that's another thing that I think is unique about the park, is just the scale of some of these habitats. We have some spectacular boreal wetland complexes that thankfully have been protected by the Land Trust and others in the Adirondacks. And they themselves are not, you know, not rare as plant communities, but the size of them, the scale of them. Spring Pond Bog, for example, and walking into a place like that really, truly makes you feel like you're in a northern habitat. And so I've been watching the birds for a long time. I'm seeing some troubling declines among those birds, and part of what I'm trying to figure out now is, you know, what's the future fauna of those communities if some of our northern species are in retreat as a result of climate change.
Thanks for that. I've often heard people remark, when I drive into the Adirondacks and get out of my car, wow, it just feels different. Can you describe to the audience how and why it might feel so different here compared to those other places? What is it? Charlie, how about you?
Well, I don't even have to get out of my car. If you study trees, you can actually do an amazing amount while driving down the highway, looking out your side window carefully, of course. So once I reach Glens Falls, heading up the Northway, I know I'm in a very different world than in the oak forests I know and love here in the Hudson Valley where I live. And I think the feeling for me is just simply knowing that I'm surrounded by the greatest concentration of wilderness east of Yellowstone. It's that simple for me.
That's great. Michele, how about you?
Yeah, I would agree. I guess for me, it's mostly the scale of things, and it's standing on top of a mountain or flying over this place in a plane. It doesn't look like anything else. It's green as far as the eye can see, and it's a pretty amazing sight to see.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that discussion on how the geographical location of the Adirondacks contributes to the unique forests and wildlife found here. The next theme is decline and recovery. Jerry further writes about wildlife. In the past 200 years, the animals in the Adirondacks have been hunted, trapped, and exposed to toxic pollution. For the last 50 years, they have had to cope with habitat changes caused by acid rain, and for at least the last 20, and I should say now 40, with ecological changes resulting from a rapidly warming climate. And on the forest side, from Phil Terry's 1993 book, Wildlife in Wilderness, Ralph Waldo Emerson, while camping in a virgin forest at Follansbee in 1858, declared, "Our patron pine was 15 in girth, the maple 8 beneath its shapely tower." Starting with Michele this time, tell us how you understand decline and recovery of wildlife in the Adirondack Park and how your thinking on this history influences your current research efforts.
Well, I, like you, Heidi, grew up in this park, and I think one of the things that we have witnessed that sort of coincided with our growing up in this park is the return of the moose, which sort of started to appear back in New York State in around 1980, having been extirpated as a result of, habitat loss and hunting and, a bunch of different forces acting at a time that many species suffered the same sort of extirpation fate. And it's a good example of one of many large charismatic mammals that were once a part of our system. At a time, this also included things like mountain lion and lynx and wolves. And, the moose has come back on its own, and it's been an amazing thing to watch. And I'm sure it's related to the recovery of our forests and the continued growth and increasing intactness of our forests. Unfortunately, we don't have some of those other species back, but, it's interesting to me that we don't have wolves, but we have a coyote that's maybe somewhere on a continuum of DNA with the wolf. It has some ways of behaving that are similar to wolves. It's certainly a kind of interesting question from a genetic standpoint. And occasionally we get the rare dispersing cougar from South Dakota that goes through the Adirondacks on its cross-country journey. So maybe there's hope that we could get those species back in the future. I don't know. I think with respect to birds, we don't have the same sources of information as we do for some of the mammals because, the birds I know best, of course, are small forest songbirds that nobody had a bounty on, probably not a lot of strong attention being paid to them. And the bird data, although very, very good, the population level tracking of bird data starts in about 1966 in this country. My suspicion, however, is that the birds have had a very similar sort of pattern of, we probably had a very forest dominated bird community, and they probably suffered large declines as a result of forest clearing and fires and other forces that changed this landscape. And we now have those birds back again, and forest birds are doing really well. I would say that to the extent that this has influenced my approach to science in the Adirondacks, I don't know, I wouldn't consider this to be any sort of planning on my part, but I have resisted focusing on any particular species, as you know, and have focused most of my work sort of up at the community level. And I enjoy asking questions at that level rather than focusing on an individual species. And that's turned out to be fortuitous because we know that individual species don't always stick around.
Great, thank you. Charlie, now to you. Tell us how you understand decline and recovery of Adirondack forests, and how has this influenced your research, and what happened to that primeval forest as described by Emerson in 1858?
Well, there is indeed a remarkable story of disturbance, I would rather say, than decline and recovery, because disturbance is just a natural process in all forests. And And that story typically revolves around, in the Adirondacks, the early logging, and particularly once railroads came in and clear cutting began, and then there were the massive fires in the early 1900s that burned through the slash left behind by that logging. And the regrowth of forest cover in the whole eastern US, frankly, is indeed a really heartening demonstration of the resilience of our forests. But it's important to remember and acknowledge that the Adirondacks contain almost all of the acreage in the eastern US of what remains of our old growth forests that were never logged. Many states have done thorough surveys of their old growth remnants and can only count hundreds, if a couple of thousand of acres of old growth forests. Barbara McMartin's wonderful book, Great Forest of the Adirondacks, one of her many wonderful books, documents the shenanigans in Albany that led to the protection of hundreds of thousands of acres in the late 1800s of old growth forest once the forest preserve was established. And so, and while those forests have never been logged, it is disheartening to have to acknowledge that they're in many ways a shadow of their former selves. Beech was clearly the most abundant tree in those pre-settlement old growth forests, at least at lower elevations. And for the past, 75 years, beech has been hit hard by beech bark disease, introduced to Nova Scotia in the 1890s and slowly and inexorably spreading westward. When I did my PhD research in the Five Ponds Wilderness in the late 70s, early 80s, it hadn't reached there yet. And the beech trees, those forests were just magnificent. Of course, they were hit very hard by a storm in 1995, and most of those beautiful forests blew down quite naturally. But and so frankly, until we find a solution for beech bark disease, and I hope that comes someday, it's just going to be the case that those forests are sort of a shadow of their former selves. And that doesn't very neatly fit within this rubric of disturbance and recovery, which has organized most ecological research in forests for decades. We have to come up with a new way to think about how forests cope with this really wide range of stresses and threats from humans.
That's great. Thanks so much for that. The third theme that we're going to talk about tonight is the increasing overlap of where people live and where animals live. In the previous century, the park has become older and wilder, yet settlement and people, or the human footprint, continues to expand. Roads, private lands development, recreation, invasive species, forestry management, all contribute to the overlap of human and wild species. Michele, which of these activities that promote this overlap are you most familiar with in your research, and how do wildlife fare in these circumstances?
Well, as you know, I work for the Adirondack Watershed Institute, and one of the flagship programs that we are involved with, and which I am now involved with through a research standpoint, is trying to safeguard water quality, and in particular to prevent the spread of invasive species in our aquatic systems. And so we hire about 150 people every summer who are located at boat launches all over northern New York State. Many of you have probably run into these folks whose job is to talk with aquatic recreation folks and try to make sure that we aren't moving organisms around the landscape. And this is, to me, a really interesting example of sort of a human and natural system that we are very much in the driver's seat of, literally, as we drive around with our boats on our roadways. And in this case, it's an instance of us moving both wildlife and plants that we don't want from one place to another. But I'm struck by the similarities in that work and parallels to some of the things that you and I have worked on together, Heidi, in the terrestrial realm. And it really has to do with sort of the choices we make about where we live in this landscape and where we recreate in this landscape and how that impacts critters. And we, of course, have looked for a long time at one specific issue of residential development, and in particular, sort of backcountry residential development outside of town. What does it mean when we sort of spread ourselves out in a low density pattern across the landscape and choose to live sort of deep in the forest? And there are many lessons that have come out of that work that lots of folks on this call have heard me talk about before. But I would say that if there's one overarching message from all of that work, is that we tend to, simplify our ecosystems. When we create habitats and disturbances in association with where we are living, we tend to favor a small number of pretty generalist, common cosmopolitan species, unfortunately at the expense of a much larger number of the sort of more rare and more specialized and maybe more regionally adapted species. And just to think about this from an example of a bird, you know, I'm sure that not very many real estate agents in the Adirondacks get calls from folks about where they should choose to live here so that they can see a blue jay. But I know they get those questions about loons. And loons are one of it, you know, they're an example of a species that's sort of, it's a regional specialty, a little bit sensitive, not to residential development so much, but it's an example of the kind of phenomenon that we tend to create. And of course, now you and I have sort of taken that question of what happens in association with residential development and thought now about, you know, do we see the same thing with regards to recreation? We're finding at our boat launches that there are at least 25% more people in the water this summer. And we can probably guess that there's at least that many more people on the land this summer. And we're now trying to look at the questions, not just of where we choose to live, but where we recreate and the implications that that has for wildlife. And do we sort of create some of these same circumstances in the context of the spatial and temporal patterns of recreation that we do in the sort of residential realm.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Charlie, what about the overlap of humans and forests and forest health? Might you be able to share some insights on forestry or invasive species influences or any other topic?
Sure. You know, I actually try to avoid thinking in terms of forest health. I can certainly apply that concept to an individual tree, but it becomes problematic when applied to a community. So if sugar maple was, for instance, displaced by a non-native invasive species like Norway maple, would the forest be less healthy? Well, in terms of a lot of basic and fundamental ecosystem processes, they would be very similar. You know, foresters often talk about, you know, removing all of the low-grade trees to make a forest more healthy. You know, by that logic, our human communities would be healthier if anybody who wasn't perfectly healthy moved away. So as a scientist, I try to just focus on, you know, what controls the structure and function of these forests and leave the value judgments about what conditions we most desire to others. You know, that said, there's simply no question that humans have been, are, and will continue to be, you know, the drivers of what happens in Adirondack forests. They have for hundreds of years. And not just when they live in close proximity to the forest and the park. You know, the most important threats in our forests are regional and global in nature. You know, climate change, invasive species, forest pests and pathogens, they all start outside the blue line. But at least in the case of invasive species and forest pests and pathogens, human activity within the park matters enormously. So, you know, if we don't get our boats washed at those boat wash stations, if we don't clean our boats moving between lakes, or if we bring in firewood from outside of the blue line and bring an emerald ash borer in, you know, these are the vectors that will bring these threats right into the heart of the park. And the more fragmentation, you know, we create through development, the more pervasively those threats can spread. You know, the Adirondacks is home to really a spectacular invasive species program, APIP, the Adirondack Plant Park Invasive Species Program, which has been a model for invasive species control across New York State. And you know, it is the case that people have gotten a little disheartened about how effectively we can control invasive species. And the Adirondacks are fairly unique in that we have, you know, the avenues for those species to get into the park are fairly constrained. And so if we can sort of guard those routes, the main highway routes, and try to limit the introduction, you know, we have potential here in the Adirondacks that frankly is long gone in most of the rest of the highly fragmented Northeast. It's why I still have real hope and you know, support these programs as much as I can.
That's great. Thanks so much to both of you for that discussion. Let's shift to theme 4. This is a little bit more of our longer theme. It's about change over time. We've obviously been discussing this a little bit because it really does underscore all that we know about the park. But what is in store for us in the future? Right now, we happen to be in a state of major change in the world. Really, we are at the intersection of three crises: a worldwide pandemic, a global reckoning with racial justice, and the impacts of climate change. How do these affect future science on forests and wildlife in the Adirondacks? What do we need to be thinking about? I know it's a big question, so let's try to take this topic, we'll break it down a little bit and do it one at a time. So first off, let's think about COVID-19. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is a zoonosis, meaning it likely jumped from animal to human. Additionally, it caused the world to lock down. And as we've been emerging or not emerging, we're still here on Zoom. It turns out that a lot of people are enjoying places like the Adirondacks, which Michele already alluded to. We have relatively low population and lots of opportunity to social distance. So what does COVID-19 bring to the fore in your minds in terms of the future of forests and wildlife in the Adirondacks? What should we be thinking about? Where do we need to go with this topic? Michele, how about you first?
Well, the first thing that comes to my head with respect to COVID, Heidi, is us at the beginning of the field season trying to think about where we were going to work for the social science piece of our recreation project, and asking ourselves, is COVID going to mean that we have far fewer hikers to interview because that is the bulk of the data collection, or is COVID going to mean that we have far more? And it's turning out to mean that we have plenty of people in the woods, and probably many of whom we don't even get a chance to speak with. So that, of course, for me, raises questions of what it means for wildlife, because that's what I tend to think about the most. Certainly, if you read the paper or drive down through the Cascades, you can't help but notice the levels of folks that are in the woods. And I'm certain that the wildlife are also noticing the levels of people in the woods, and some of the unfortunate things that we've heard that are occurring there. And so that's one of the things that comes to mind with respect to COVID and wildlife in the Adirondacks. And the other relates really to what Charlie mentioned in the previous question, which is that, we know some things about the circumstances that can create, ripe conditions for a pandemic. We know that diseases can jump from wildlife to humans. We know it's happened before, we know it'll happen again, and we know that the likelihood of it is greatly increased when we have more fragmentation, more weakening of sort of the fabric of an ecosystem, and a reduction in that intactness that we know is important. It just brings us more into contact with wildlife that we otherwise wouldn't probably be in contact with, and increases the chances of that happening. So I think that we have to keep that in mind, not just as we think about managing the Adirondacks, but every landscape across the planet.
Okay, and how about Charlie?
Well, I'm not sure the trees care how many people walk by them. So in terms, I am, I'm in many ways thrilled that at the number of people taking advantage of the Adirondacks and getting out. I live in the Hudson Valley, so most of my time is spent down here, and I've spent more time. I always, all these trails that I never bothered to hike here because I would drive north, I'm now hiking, and I only go during the week because on the weekends they're too crowded to hike, and it's starting to look like Route 73 down here, which is sort of horrifying. And so there are a whole host of challenging questions raised for park management. But I'd have to say that this is, in terms of thinking about forest condition and impacts on the forest, this is way down on my list. There are so many other both opportunities and challenges with managing this, the user pressure in the park. I've always argued that, the park needs a broader base of support by New Yorkers. More New Yorkers need to be coming up and taking advantage of it, but that means we have to be able to manage them without degrading the resource. And that's a real challenge. And that's one that thankfully is outside my expertise.
There's an interesting assumption that you brought up in that last point, which is that if we just get people into the woods, they would become supporters of this place. And I'm just curious, maybe both of you could shed some light on that assumption. Is that how it works? If people just go into the woods, will they support the conservation of this place or the long-term management of this place in the way that it needs to be supported? But
you're the social scientist. You get to tell us. I'm I'm a botanist.
Fortunately, I'm the moderator tonight, so I can flip it back to you guys. Based on your expert opinion.
I think it's a question that we still don't know the answer to. I think the assumption is that we just need to bring people into the woods and that will magically make them, you know, be good stewards. And I think that that is probably not always the case. And I also think that the other assumption is that it's perfectly possible to always do sort of to meet the dual goals of providing public access and protecting natural resources and biodiversity. The assumption is that you can always do those two things at the same time in protected areas. And I would argue that it's not quite that easy and not a guarantee by any means.
It does seem like COVID-19, with people's renewed interest in getting outside because it's the only thing that people can do, there may be an opportunity to really be thinking about this. So I thank you both for thinking about that and keeping that in mind. I don't know, Charlie, did you want to add to what Michaela had said?
No, I defer to the both of you. You're far more knowledgeable about this than I am.
Great. Well, okay, on to the next big crises regarding the reckoning with racial justice. It seems to me to date that forest and wildlife research in the Adirondacks has been conducted and communicated by a relatively narrow subset of today's population. So my question is, how can we become more inclusive? What are the ways in which we can broaden the discussion and bring in new perspectives? How about Charlie? Why don't you go take a
Yeah, you know, I'm an ecologist. I've been a member of the Ecological Society of America for over 40 years. This is the world's largest professional scientific society for ecologists, and recently served for 6 years on the society's governing board. You know, and the society's main functions are the traditional science society functions of publishing high quality journals and holding meetings for our scientists. And but one of the programs at ESA that I'm most proud of is a program called SEEDS, and I have to remember it's Strategies for Ecology, Education, Diversity, and Sustainability. This is a program that was started about 25 years ago by Alan Berkowitz, my longtime colleague and one of my oldest friends here at the Carey Institute. And the program has chapters on campuses across the country and begins recruiting students into ecology careers in high school, and then mentors them through high school and through college and graduate school. But even after 25 years, I have to say that progress has been really frustratingly slow. I don't have any particular expertise or insight into how to speed this up, except to say that it has to start with, I believe, start with getting children out into the wild. So I'm gonna go back to that assumption that if you get kids out in the woods or on a lake, or actually the best thing is to take them out to a creek and let them turn over rocks in a creek. That'll get them every time. So when, you know, and when I think of what a week of summer camp in the Adirondacks, you know, can mean to a 10-year-old, I think that's where we have to start. And I think we just have to accept that this is a very long process. I don't see any easy answers. I think this takes generations. And I think a lot of very good people have been, you know, colleagues of mine, people I admire greatly, have been working for many, many years, and it's just very slow progress.
Thank you. How about you, Michaela?
Yeah, I would say, you know, I'm at Paul Smith College. We are a tiny college, and as you can imagine, most folks there look like me, look like us, and it's a significant challenge, and we are working on it and struggling with it the way that many are right now. And I agree, we don't have any easy answers either. I see a few things happening that I think are good. We are working with some other colleges and universities in the northern New York area, St. Lawrence, Clarkson, Potsdam, for example, to try to put together some, you know, coordinated programming across our campuses. And we're also partnered with the diversity initiative here in town, the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, which I think is doing terrific stuff. I mean, unfortunately, we still have to do all of this as Zoom meetings at night, but they've got programming, you know, every other day, and we're working with them to see that we could eventually bring some workshops onto campus to do those sorts of things too. And we've had some conversations among students on campus, some town hall types of meetings. We're also trying, again, it's a slow process, but to increase cultural diversity from the standpoint of bringing international students, which is another challenge for a tiny school. like where we are. And it's a challenge not only to get folks here from other places, but also to make them feel supported and welcomed once they are here. And I think it's really important to have that be always a part of the discussion as we do move through this process. But I definitely agree with Charlie that getting kids out is fundamental, and Paul Smith is great at that. At least we've got a great opportunity to have them out right on campus in a spectacular setting, and get them into the woods as often as we can.
Great, thank you. Okay, for the third crisis, the climate change. As Bill McKibben writes in the foreword of Jerry Jenkins, one of his other books, Climate Change in the Adirondacks, although global in scale, the impact of climate change will be felt and its effects will need to be fought at the local level. What does this mean for us? What will future forests look like? What wildlife will be here? How might intact forests and ecosystem resiliency influence future forests and wildlife of the Adirondacks? And if the Adirondacks is a stage, will the stage still be here? Will the players be the same? What do we need to be thinking about in terms of climate change and Adirondack forests and wildlife and the science of it all? Michele, how about to you first?
Yeah, I would start by sort of reiterating just the notion that change is maybe the only thing that we can rely on. And you know, in my lifetime, we've seen a lot of changes within wildlife communities. Or certainly we're not turkeys in the Adirondacks when I was young. And they're all over the place now. We've got moose, that we know that these things are going to happen. I think some of the most interesting thinking that I have seen recently has been around the idea of resilience. And I want to define that and say resilience from an ecological standpoint, and not resilience, the word that everybody is now using in every sector of society, but resilience in a discrete sense of thinking that there are a couple of characteristics of landscapes that confer on them theoretically the ability to support biodiversity through time. Maybe not the same biodiversity, but to support a diversity of species. And those characteristics are things like, you know, geophysical diversity, landform diversity, and connectedness, intactness. So you have the geophysical diversity that gives you the microclimates that you need for species to find the niches that they're adapted to. You have the connectivity, and that gives them the ability to actually travel through landscapes and reach those microclimates. And the thought is that these characteristics together are the best chance to sort of, you know, maintain a suite of species, a high diversity of species in a given location. It's important, though, to point out that this concept, it relies on the idea of not who those specific species are, but just the ability of the landscape to support that diversity. So you have to get away from the idea, unfortunately, that we're going to always have the same species here. It really is more about the stage than it is about the players. And I can borrow a baseball analogy and say that, you know, my husband would acknowledge that in 50 years we won't have the same players on the Yankees, but man, I hope we still have the Yankees. And it's sort of the same idea that we need to get behind here, I think, with respect to wildlife, at least in the Adirondacks, that, you know, we might not be able to have the same suite of species always, but we've got, I think, in the characteristics of this Adirondack Park, a better sort of situation going in than a lot of the rest of Eastern North America, at least. And one example, I guess, that's giving me a little bit of hope in this realm right now is that, you know, I've been watching boreal birds in again, some of our charismatic mega wetlands for 15 years. And I'm seeing 7 out of 8 of the species that I'm tracking, unfortunately, going not the way that I would like them to, going down and declining. And probably I'm going to lose some of my northern Canadian bird friends whom I've become really attached to. In the same 15-year period of time, we've gained a new bird in some of those habitats, some of those same spectacular wetland complexes, and it's the sandhill crane, and it's 5 feet tall, and it's breeding in Bloomingdale Bog, and it's breeding in Osita Marsh around the corner from my house, and it's a spectacular dancer. And so if I'm gonna lose my rusty blackbird, I can at least be happy that we've got a landscape that could support a sandhill crane.
I'm really happy that you used the term charismatic mega wetland, and I would like to know how you're going to be referring to the sandhill crane in the future, charismatic mega tall crane?
I don't know. I got to think about that.
Okay, Charlie, how about you?
Well, this is a loaded question for me. I've spent much of the past decade using massive national data sets and models and all we know about trees and forests to try to understand how northeastern forests might change under different climate change scenarios. We know the climate will change. We don't know exactly how much, but the predictions are dire, and predictions are getting better every few years. But all of my work points to a very inescapable and somewhat inconvenient truth, and that is that change within the tree species will be very slow, with a few notable exceptions. The most notable exception is actually balsam fir. Again, this iconic northern species that it occurs all throughout what we think of as northern forests. It's the only tree species in the Adirondacks that we've looked at that actually, where even the adults can't tolerate higher temperatures than the temperatures currently found in the Adirondacks. Basically, all the 50 other species we've looked at in eastern North America, adult trees are basically, their survival is insensitive to climate. They basically, and to understand that, you have to think about the evolution of these trees. They've spent 40, 50 million years. The tree species we have are all descendants of tropical lineages. Remember, 50 million years ago, the poles were tropical. There was enormous amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. The Earth was a very warm, humid place. And as the globe cooled over those millions of years and the forest drifted southward, the species that could tolerate the colder climates were the ones that had evolved tolerance of freezing, tolerance of temperature extremes. And so, you can make the case that temperate trees and even boreal trees are probably among the most resilient organisms. And I like Michele, I try to be careful about how I use that. I don't actually like to use that particular, maybe resistant to climate fluctuation, particularly temperature. Moisture is a little different, but most of the climate change scenarios and models suggest that if anything, we will get slightly more rainfall in the Northeast. A different scenario could change this picture. But what the life history stage that's sensitive are the seedlings. And so, the adults and even the saplings that are present in the Adirondacks, those canopy trees live on average about 100 years in the canopy. It takes a sugar maple on average in an old growth forest 100 years to get from seedling stage to the canopy. And so those saplings that are there now, the climate may become less optimal for them, but they're, basically possession is 9/10 of the law when it comes to tree competition. And so they're gonna be the next generation of trees in the canopy, and then they're gonna stay around for another 100 years. And so it's going to require southern species moving in, their seeds dispersing when they don't disperse very far. And so, our models predict that it takes 300 to 400 years before we, even under extreme climate scenarios, before we see big changes in southern species moving northward. Much sooner than that, within the next 50 years, the models would suggest that things like balsam fir will begin to disappear if they don't already disappear from the balsam woolly adelgid, which is killing balsam firs all across the park at the moment. So, you have to put climate change in the context of all these other threats. And I, like most forest ecologists, if you ask me, what is the most immediate human threat to the distribution of tree species, this is just hands down, it's introduced forest pests and pathogens. And while it's tempting to say that that's a climate that interacts with climate change, it doesn't actually. With the current threats we have, all of the insects that we're concerned about, except the hemlock woolly adelgid, their native range in Asia, where most of them came from, exceeds the range of the host trees they're now attacking in the Adirondacks in the Northeast. At the moment, hemlock woolly adelgid can't tolerate really cold winters. And so for a while, at least, the hemlocks in the Adirondacks have some protection, but winters are warming up faster than even our summers. Not good news for skiers, and not good news for hemlocks, because the adelgids will start to move in. Oddly enough, the thing that I worry about most with climate change is is not the introduced pests and pathogens, but all of our native tree species have literally dozens of native species of insects and diseases that they cope with every year, in and out. And every year, somewhere in the state, there's an outbreak of this insect on this host tree, or a small patch of a fungal disease. Mike Birmingham at DEC for many years put together on his own initiative with state foresters a marvelous summary all across the state of all the native pests and pathogens that you could find. And it's a long list. And many of those are the ones that worry me the most. As climate changes, what will happen to the balance between those native pests and pathogens and our native tree species? So many of you know the mountain pine beetle story in the West, where that's a native insect, but that, you know, the Rocky Mountain region has warmed faster than any other part of the continental US. And with warmer years, the mountain pine beetle is able to have 2 generations and has just devastated those forests. But it's a native insect that interacted with climate change. We don't yet have any examples I can point to, but if you wanted to ask me what keeps me up at night other than being depressed about emerald ash borer, it's this risk that climate change will interact with the native pests and pathogens.
Thanks, Charlie. And maybe since you brought it up, the emerald ash borer, do you want to say a couple of words about that and some of the
Yeah, it is just a horribly depressing story. It spreads faster than pretty much anything we've seen, and it affects essentially, as far as we can tell, all of the native ash species in eastern North America, and probably will once it gets there, many of the rarer ash species that occur in river valleys out west. In many ways, it's going to be most devastating to black ash, a swamp species that's important to indigenous peoples. It's the ash that was used in those beautiful ash baskets. And in swamp forests, it really is a dominant species when it occurs. And when the emerald ash borer comes in, it can wipe it out completely. The lack of transpiration of water from those trees can raise the water level, and you go from a swamp forest to essentially a marsh that's uninhabitable by trees. And you know, the Adirondacks, it's funny because Justin Potter has gone through some of the old records from sort of his neck of the woods, you know, up there near Brandreth, and there are records that black ash was much more common in the past. And I've wondered, I think maybe this was his idea, whether a lot of it was cut down to make railroad ties. But black ash is a really important swamp species in the upper Midwest. You know, at this point, we have no reason to think that much of anything will be spared. All of the other pests and pathogens that we deal with leave some element of the population behind, usually small ones that could keep resprouting, or, you know, the elms reproduce when they're small and they produce lots of seeds before Dutch elm disease can get them. It is just truly a very depressing story with emerald ash borer. I don't have any good news to impart.
Well, it certainly seems that based on this last few moments of discussion, we are certainly in for more change. We've already experienced a lot. We're in for more, and it will be interesting to keep track of these changes, both from the research perspective, also from the perspective of how these changes impact local communities and our ways of life here in the Adirondacks in the park. And now we are at the moment that we've all been waiting for. It's time for the audience to ask questions. I know the chat box, or the Q&A box, I should say, has been very active. And so I will just jump right in. There's a question here. It looks like it's for you, Charlie. 25 years ago, a windstorm cut down the Adirondack Forest from northwest to southeast in a line almost 100 miles long of narrowly defined devastation. Can you speak to the forest recovery along that line?
Sure. Actually, this goes back to Jerry Jenkins, because Jerry wrote the best report on that 95 blowdown, which contained very large areas of damage across a wide swath of the park. I actually had a field crew living on Stillwater Lake. We were studying wind disturbance in the Five Ponds region, and the campsite got hammered. And that was a derecho, which was just in the news, which is basically thunderstorm downbursts in a complicated, a broad, straight line wind storm. But if you look at the maps of damage that DEC put together in the air photos, no one reported it, but there is exactly a tornado track that's snaked across this whole area. And there's no other wind phenomenon that creates a long, narrow track like that than a tornado. Tornadoes get reported all the time when there are no tornadoes, just a high wind, and the National Weather Service gets reports of tornadoes. But there's no question that this had to have been a tornado. And, you know, but wind disturbance, we did a lot of research on forest succession after wind disturbance. And unlike fire, which sort of resets the forest to early successional species, these windstorms actually accelerate succession because they take out the canopy trees and the advanced regeneration. The saplings in the understory just take off. And yes, if you see a lot of big yellow birch in a forest, you know it came in after a big storm. Unfortunately, they're all hollow in the center, so you can't age them. But and so yellow birch came in those blowdowns in the 5 ponds. It's everywhere. But there's also a lot of beech, and beech does phenomenally well after these storms because it's there in the understory. It spreads its branches out, shades out everything else, and this is why foresters hate it. But so basically these storms just accelerate succession to shade tolerant species.
Great, thanks. Michaela, would you have anything to add on that?
No, that was a great explanation.
This next one, I think, is for you. Given nearly 3 million acres, wait a minute, oops, I'm missing the first part of it. Okay, we enjoy 2.7 million acres of public protected forever wild land. Given nearly 3 million acres, why should anyone care about what happens on the other 3 million? Haven't New Yorkers already protected everything we need to care about in the 3 million we already purchased as forest preserve? Why is the other 3 million important? Michaela, I'm gonna let you take a stab at that first.
Well, if you are a wildlife-oriented person like me, then you do really care about what happens on the other 3 million acres. And it is in part because we don't have necessarily the same stuff on the forest preserve as we do on the private lands. And of course, this is a long battle in the Adirondacks, and it always will be a part of our dialogue here. But you could argue that if we are sort of the perfect example of, you know, an experiment in conservation biology, as we are often described, that we would have sort of this equal amounts of all of our habitat types on the forest preserve in well-protected status and also on our private lands. And it turns out that if you sort of take a look at the distribution of habitat types that we have in this park, there are some that are very well represented on both the forest preserve and on the private lands, things like northern hardwood forest, which is kind of the matrix forest that we enjoy as the backdrop. But there are a lot of other smaller, patchy, tinier things that are disproportionately, you know, on our private lands. And that has, in my view, some important ramifications for wildlife, things like floodplain forests. And this is by no means an Adirondack phenomenon. It is throughout the Northeast. You think about where, you know, the little towns they all got settled in the floodplains. And those floodplain forests and riparian forests in general are super important for wildlife. In the Adirondacks, we've got this whole different geography over in the Champlain Hills with spectacularly diverse plant communities on the top of some of those hills and just different birds over there. And so if you are, you know, one of the species that cares about some of those habitats, then you kind of have to pay attention to what happens on the private lands as well as on the public lands, because you can't just make the assumption that all the wildlife can go live on the forest preserve and it doesn't matter what we do anywhere else.
Great, thanks. Charlie, do you have anything to add to that question?
I can't improve on that. That was perfect.
Okay, well then maybe you can talk a little about how beavers are recovering and impacting the forests.
Well, you know, this is an interesting story. Beavers were one of my longtime colleagues here at the Carey, Clive Jones, has helped coin the term ecosystem engineers. And you know, the beaver is a perfect example of a species that does modify the environment in very dramatic ways. But of course, actually where I live in Dutchess County, the land I live on was purchased from the English Crown in 1692 by 9 land speculators in Manhattan. to trap beaver. And they trapped the beaver out, and then the English crown forced them to subdivide and sell to farmers. They didn't really want to. They bought the property because it had the last undeveloped shoreline on the Hudson River in 1692 down by Fishkill between New York City and Albany on this side of the river. Same thing happened in the Adirondacks. Beaver were trapped out, and they were responsible for a very dynamic landscape of these sort of flooding, but then abandoning and creating these marvelously diverse sort of wet meadows. And so a very dynamic landscape. And there's been a fair bit of work thinking about what are the consequences of removing beaver, eliminating all of that habitat for a fairly long period of time, and now recreating that dynamic habitat. And I can't say, so there are some concerns that, are all the plants that once lived in those marshes, those incredibly rich, diverse, marsh habitats, where did they hang out for the 50, 70, 100 years when there were no beaver around? Have they been successful in coming back? Unfortunately, we know very little about exactly how diverse those communities were prior to the trapping of the beavers. So, I'd like to think that they held on somewhere. I still remember, I don't know if Tim Barnett's on, but I remember, hiking through the blowdown in 95 to get from Wanakina down into Five Ponds, a miserable hike. The trails had not been cleared, and crawling on our hands and knees with packs, through the debris, and then finding this magnificent orchid right in the middle of destruction. It was a little patch with no debris on the ground. And I remember sending a picture of this to Tim, who at the time was recovering from his accident in Kazakhstan. And it was really, so these species are, are pretty robust. I'd like to think they held out on stream banks somewhere, but I think it's still an open question.
That's great. Here's another question about restoration. Could restoration of missing top predators, particularly puma and wolf, help Adirondack forests remain resilient in the face of climate chaos? Kaylee, would you like to take a crack at that first?
Well, I think, to the extent that some of those species are associated with large intact landscapes, as they return, if that means that we've got a healthy enough landscape to support something like that, then yes, I think that the associated sort of intactness of the landscape would help us be resilient in the face of climate change. The other thing that comes to mind for me, and Charlie could speak on this probably better than I can, is if we had some of those large predators, what would be the consequences for our deer, whom we know have large impacts on our forest structure?
Yeah, I think I would love to see fewer deer. There's just simply no question that deer densities, even in the Adirondacks, where harsh winters have historically tended to keep the population in check, the deer densities are impacting forest productivity and the resilience of this ecosystem. It's just no question about that. I have a question though for McKeely. I've been wondering about the wolf reintroduction. So, all of these large mammals, I just think of the bears that have recolonized Dutchess County. We used to just get the young males kicked out by mama and told to go somewhere, and they would wander into Dutchess County. They'd end up in Poughkeepsie. DEC would trap them and haul them back to the Housatonics or the Berkshires or Catskills. But eventually females started coming in, and we now have a very healthy reproducing population of black bear. I mean, nobody has bird feeders anymore because you can't keep the bears out of them. So if a wolf came in, would it find coyotes and would it interbreed with them? And would we know if we had wolves coming in? If a lone male wolf comes in, it's unlikely to find the dispersing lone female wolf, but could we, the genetics of coyote, wolf, and dog have gotten so muddled, and I don't keep up with the literature. Is this a crazy idea of mine that we might be getting wolf genes into the population and barely even know it?
No, I don't think it's crazy at all. And this is not my expertise either, but what I do read suggests that it is by no means clear that our coyote is just coyote, that the wolf that, we once had didn't at some point also incorporate coyote DNA. And so I think that it is an interesting question. And you know, in some ways, I think we've got a coyote that behaves a little bit like a wolf. Sometimes, you know, they do hunt in packs at least some of the time, which is not generally as much of a behavior associated with coyotes. But then other times they seem more like a smaller, scrappier animal that eats a little bit lower on the size of the prey base. And so I think they're somewhere in the middle, and it would be a very interesting scenario if wolves came back in, what it would mean both sort of ecologically and also legally, because we know that there are all kinds of interesting questions around reintroducing species and endangered species.
This, Heidi will appreciate this. Social scientists did an economic analysis of the benefits of reintroduction of mountain lion in the East. Basically, the calculation has to do with how many human lives are saved by reducing the number of deer automobile collisions. And so they came up with a number. And then when you read carefully, this is what only academics could do this. They report that the net benefit in terms of lives saved after subtracting out the 2.3 humans who would be eaten by mountain lions every year, right? There was some number like that. And, you know, I mean, Michaela, you probably both remember, you know, the fight over reintroducing moose. You know, Tom Jorling tells this story that, you know, DC was all set to bring moose back, and then the impact statement showed that there would be some collision, and nobody wants to hit a moose with a car. It's very scary and dangerous. And you know, at least as I recall him telling this story, that it was that sort of concern that derailed the moose introduction. But this study for mountain lions suggested a massive reduction in human fatalities from, you know, across the eastern U.S., of course, not just in the Adirondacks. And so, you know, it's worth thinking about all the dimensions of what, I have to say, sending field assistants out in the woods, if they were both mountain lions and wolves, is a really interesting thought. You know, I'd want to think twice before I, you know, had to tell some parent that their undergraduate, my field assistants were, you know, eaten by a mountain lion. I haven't figured that one out.
There's so many resilient field assistants out west that do it every day, right?
Yeah, no, it is. It's something. It's a fact.
It would definitely be a difficult conversation to have, though, with parents. Okay, on to the next question. I think, Michaela, this one will go to you. Down on Long Island, it seems like there's much more species diversity, especially in birds, now that there was when I was a kid in the 1980s. I wonder a lot lately, how much is due to conservation and environmental protection, and how much, if any, is due more broadly to climate change?
If that question is specifically about Long Island, I don't know that I can really provide a lot of answer. It's just not a system that I've worked in at all. I can say that here in the Adirondacks, you know, we certainly are seeing some new species that are coming in. Sandhill crane is not an example of one that I think is being driven by climate change. I think it's just doing really well and expanding from its Midwestern regions. But there are other species that we have seen coming into the system in recent times that are increasing pretty rapidly, things like Carolina wren, and you know, there's Baltimore oriole in my backyard now, which is really strange, and some other things that we think of as more characteristically southern, or certainly whose distributions are more to the south of here. And that process might be happening more quickly than the retreat of some of our more northern species, and so maybe that does, you know, manifest as an increase in species diversity, both here and possibly on Long Island.
Charlie, would you have anything to add on that question?
I think this requires an enormous amount of very good natural history and ecology of each of the species to really understand. It's hard to come up with generalities. I like Michaela's earlier comment about trying to think about the ensemble and will this ecosystem continue to support the kind of diversity we see. And I feel better about that in the Adirondacks with the amount of protected and preserved land than I do in most other places. But it's still, there are a lot of open questions about how all this could change.
Okay, so this is like a longer question with a preamble. Having just purchased almost 20 acres of forest in the southwest corner of the Adirondacks, I thought that leaving the forest alone was a good management strategy. But now, with increasing awareness of invasive plant species, overabundance of deer, and threats to trees from pests and pathogens, I am realizing that leaving the forest alone may mean losing the forest. While it's daunting to think about managing invasive plants on 20 acres, it's even more daunting to think about what will happen to the rest of the park. Will remote campsites eventually be a tangle of multiflora rows and mile-a-minute weed? Charlie, would you like to tackle that one?
You know, I've been trying not to plug the book, but I do talk about this in Forest Adrift. And 20 acres is a lot. You know, if it were 5 acres, I would say, go for it. You can control all of those invasive species. 20 acres is a lot. The point I want to make about this is that it is not a foregone conclusion that the addition of a non-native and even invasive, meaning that it's spreading rapidly, that the addition of that species leads to the reduction in the abundance or distribution of a native species. That's simply not the case, particularly with understory plants. Now, so, you know, yeah, multiflora rose is nasty. Nobody wants to fight through it. But frankly, hobblebush is, you know, not much fun to walk through, you know, in the Adirondacks, one of our most common native shrubs. You know, mile-a-minute and Japanese stiltgrass. A lot of these things are coming in forests that have a depauperate understory because of their land use history, particularly down in other parts of New York where the forest went through agriculture that eliminated all the native understory species. The trees, oddly enough, come back first, but you've got basically no native understory. And so, you know, whether you think of this in terms of sort of unexploited space, empty niches, but even when there are native species in the understory, there's just not a lot of reason to assume that the addition of these non-native species will lead to a concomitant reduction in the abundance of the native species. Now, trees, this is not, the trees are a zero-sum game. You can only pack so many trees in the canopy. So as Norway maple, ailanthus, you know, these invasive trees slowly spread into the Northeast, that will come at the reduction in the abundance of native species. But in the understory, it's not the case. And frankly, quite often what you find is these species go through a pulse and then they sort of settle down. And you know, garlic mustard was way more common in my bit of woods than it is now. And, you know, we all freaked out when it came in, but, you know, if you get desperate, you can eat it. It makes pretty good pesto, apparently. And so, you know, so I think these forests can be left alone and then they can cope if, to some degree. I do think stewardship is one of our highest callings. And so, but being sort of selective about how you choose to do your management, just don't wear yourself out. There's some wonderful groups in the park taking on species like Japanese knotweed, which I consider, you know, aquatic invasives to me are a whole different story. And, you know, the Watershed Institute, groups in the park are working very hard on these. But in the forest understory, you know, compared to the threats from aquatic invasives, I consider these forest understory invasives to be, you know, learn to live with it. So sorry if that sounds flip, but that's sort of, I think, the best answer I can give.
All right, thanks. There's another question that came in on the chat. Can you explain the importance of vernal pools in forest preservation?
Kaylee?
I could explain the importance of vernal pools for amphibian conservation. You know, they are fundamental parts of the system, and amphibians themselves are, you know, base of the food chain and some of the highest biomass of any wildlife that we've got here. And so to the extent that several species rely very strongly on vernal pools, they're absolutely critical, and they're unfortunately overlooked in much of our management. You know, there's not a lot of legislative protection for vernal pools in very many places, and sometimes at the town level, you know, if there's a concerned group of folks that are aware and make that an issue, then you can get some good protections for vernal pools. But I think they are particularly challenging and yet very, very important from the standpoint of habitat for those species as the place where they, you know, perpetuate their life. From a forest standpoint, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Oh, that's really where their key is with the amphibians.
Okay, I think we're getting towards the end. I'm going to put out one more question, which Charlie, you've sort of talked about a little bit, but it seems like it's apropos for ending on this evening. Any thoughts on what the forest, including kind of the wildlife that might be in it, might look like in 200 or 400 years? It's a long way out. There's a lot of variables that could impact that, but what are your thoughts from both of you? I don't know who wants to go first. Charlie?
Okay, you want to start?
No.
I mean, we run our models out, you know, trying to forecast more than 100 years or so is almost a fool's errand, simply because there's so much that could intervene. You know, you can say, if given what we know now, and we put a scenario out there that the climate is going to do this, and there are these 3 pests and pathogens, and logging is going to stay the way it is now, I can tell you what our models predict. And you know, in 200 years, other than the fact that balsam fir is much less abundant under any climate change scenario, you know, the rest of the species and emerald and ash trees and hemlocks basically disappear from the Adirondacks. But biomass productivity, the other species just close ranks and keep going. And this has been the story. You know, it's this gradual loss of the players on the stage, if you will, the loss of species while whoever's left behind takes up that space. And, you know, but by about 400 years out, you know, our models predict very profound changes and in some unusual ways. Actually, basically what are now spruce fir forests tend to get to become maple and beech dominated forests. But the sort of the more northern hardwoody forests, the 2 species that appear to be most likely to benefit are actually white pine and liriodendron, tulip tree. The tallest trees in eastern North America, some of the most productive in terms of biomass. I mean, neither one of them's hugely valuable in terms of stumpage, but these are, you know, these are magnificent trees, and they, we project that they would become very abundant in the Adirondacks within 400 years. White pine's doing really well across the Northeast. You find it in the understory in all sorts of conditions. Liriodendron tulip tree is still very much right at its northern range limit, and you know, around near the blue line, but there are scattered ones in the park, obviously, and they'll be the seed source. So, you know, and the northern conifers just continue to decline. They do, you know, particularly except at the very highest elevations, under even modest climate change scenarios, they gradually disappear by 400 years. That and 2 bits will buy you a cup of coffee at the diner. You know, I think it's worth making these projections. I think that it's just worth being cautious about how much faith we have in them.
Michaela, how about you? Anything on the wildlife front, given the potential for white pine and tulips to be?
Yeah, you know, I would preface in the same way by saying it's 400 years is a timeline I can hardly wrap my head around from an ecological standpoint. There's too many variables in the equation to really make any good predictions. Like, you know, sadly, I think probably all the birds I've been watching, all those northern, you know, Canadian boreal species, many of whom are tightly tied to those conifers, are the ones that we're gonna, you know, probably definitely lose. Even the palm warbler, who's doing great right now, is a species that needs those conifers. I think we'll gain a lot of new species from the south. Some of them will do great and some of them won't. I think, you know, climate change, to the extent that I've looked at any of this in the literature, climate change, again, tends to benefit some of the generalists pretty well. So if they're already good at exploiting a lot of different types of habitats and situations, then the generalists may rule, especially if we get, you know, a huge influx also of development as a result of people wanting to be here in a warmer climate and in a post-pandemic world. That's going to change the game too. But beyond that, I'm not really sure what I would say about the wildlife communities.
I think it's suffice to say that there are a lot of variables that could impact this Adirondacks, and it will certainly be interesting over time to continue thinking about the research and what scientists are finding, what people are finding as they're out on the landscape. And this has certainly been a very enlightening and interesting discussion tonight. So I'd like to really take this opportunity to thank Michaela and Charlie for sharing their impressive insights regarding the science of forests and wildlife in the Adirondacks. And I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience for attending and engaging and being open to science and new ways of thinking and imagining that the research can inspire. I hope you have each gleaned some nugget of insight that you'll carry with you and apply somewhere else on your journey. So I'll turn it back over to Mike for a final say for the night. So thank you very much and good night.
Thank you, Heidi, very much. I appreciate the chance to listen in. We're grateful to Michaela and Heidi and Charlie for making the sacrifice tonight to be together, and we're grateful to all the attendees who make our work possible and who made time for this evening. Before we go, I'd just like to plug a program like this that we're doing next Tuesday evening, August 18th, from 7 to 8 p.m. About our first summer intern's work, Jess Grant. She explored 22 public land trust project sites this summer with her map and compass and canoe and kayak. And she'll share her findings and talk about the ups and downs of fieldwork during COVID-19. Most of her work gathered information for social media posts, and I'm very interested to see the breadth of that. She's a fascinating young lady, and we were really honored to have her on the team this summer. So I hope that many of you can join us next Tuesday evening from 7 to 8 for Jess Grant's presentation. And with that, we'll say thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you in real life someday soon. Have a good night.